Welcome back. I'm thankful for one who watched the first session from yesterday, just kind of introducing the idea that we're going to be looking at emotionally healthy spirituality by Peter Scazzaro. Maybe I'll put up later a link to the reference itself so that you can purchase it on your own. I also believe that I have corrected my audio issues. It sounded good yesterday, and it's sounding good here. So hopefully I won't have to delete this and re-record it like I did earlier. Trick was plugging the headphones into the computer, not into the microphone. I have like a Blue Yeti, so it's got its own microphone port, and so um, I went ahead and did that, and it seems like the audio is working. So what we're looking at today is chapter one of the book Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. Now, last night at around 6 o'clock, went live and played some video games with my daughter. We played Bowser's Fury, and we talked a little bit about emotional maturity throughout the conversation, throughout the time we were playing the game together. Now, after watching it, I realized that our volume was too low on the microphone, so it was hard to hear a lot of the conversation. So I apologize for that if you ended up watching that, and we'll correct it for today. We I still have us on the schedule at 6 p.m. We may do that a little earlier tonight because I have some plans with some friends who just made to go watch a soccer game, and so if that happens, then I'll probably just stream it earlier, and but it will be out there later today. So, and I think we'll probably play more Bowser's Fury. I don't know. It depends on what mood she's in, or what she wants to watch. So, chapter one of Emotionally Healthy Spirituality by Peter Scazzaro. If you remember or if you didn't watch it, you're just watching this now. If you last night or yesterday, what I mentioned was he talks about top this iceberg model when it comes to the transformation of a believer into the image of Jesus, right? That's I think the agreed upon goal that we're supposed to transform from whoever we are into the person of Jesus while still maintaining aspects of our own personality, right? God doesn't want robots. He wants people to be conformed to the image of his son. But he also uh, gave us our individuality and gave us our specific characteristics that make you you, right, and make me me. And so, with that being the goal, there's always been this, questioning or wondering, like, how do I get there? Right? And Scazero talks about how currently the current model for this kind of transformation to occur in Christianity is for it to happen by first, coming to know Jesus, right? You get saved, then you go to church, you attend church, and then he talked about the tip of the iceberg in this transformation model being what most churches address, and that's connecting, serving, and giving, right? Connecting with other believers through uh, you know, Bible studies and small groups and prayer meetings and so on and so forth, and then serving with these groups, serving with others, feeding the poor and helping the homeless and working with orphans and so on and so forth. And then you have the giving aspect where you're giving your time, you're giving your money, right? And what Scazero talks about in the intro was how when you're at that surface level, you're just at that very tip of that iceberg, and you're not really seeing everything that's going on underneath and underneath in your existence, meaning like it's easy to do those things and kind of then address only what people are seeing on the outside, right? They're seeing that you go to church, they're seeing that you're attending Bible study, they're seeing that you're attending small groups or whatever, and then they're seeing that you're giving. And then we have that whole struggle too, like should I be seen when I'm giving all that kind of thing. But people are seeing what you do, and so that's very surface level because what we see is not everything, right? We have a lot underneath this. And so one of the first things he talks about after going through chapter one, I read it this morning, and he gives up a lot of anecdotes about how his immaturity hurt him in the past. There was a moment here where his daughter almost drowned just because he wasn't willing to tell somebody that he just couldn't meet, like develop boundaries. We'll talk about that in a minute. But uh, once he gets past all the anecdotes, and he talks about how he himself received Christ, he brings up the iceberg model again, which we just discussed. Then he gets to this point here where uh, he addresses what's just below that what's under that iceberg that we don't see, and that's the different components of who we are. We can see the graphic there. I know it's a little small, but there's an emotional aspect to us. There's a social aspect to us. There's an intellectual aspect to us. There's a spiritual aspect to us, and a physical one. Right now, in my classes, what I like to do is I like to divide that into body, spirit, and soul. Okay, talking about the human existence. And so with the body, that covers the physical, right? Although we can have a discussion certainly about how all these other aspects are kind of tied into our body and the experiences that we have in our body. And then we have, I'm going to skip spirit for a second. We have our soul, and our soul, I believe, is comprised of two parts. Okay, so the soul is comprised of the heart and the mind, right? And you look at heart and mind is where we have uh, that breakdown where he breaks down emotional, social, intellectual, spiritual. You can, or sorry, not spiritual, emotional, social, intellectual. You can break that into heart and mind, right? Heart and mind, and they're not mutually exclusive. There's a reason why I put them in a soul. We can think of the heart as just being the emotions, and certainly the Hebrew concept of what a heart is, or what Jesus talked about in Mark chapter 7. It is this, it is, and it is the seat of human emotions. It's also the place of the will. So the mind, heart, will are very closely related, and associated with the will, and that a lot of times the decisions we make are emotional ones. Right, we want to do something like, or we have feelings about something we want to do, and so we make decisions based on that. Right, like I want to exercise today. I feel like exercising today. And so you go, you make a decision to exercise. I feel like you can be hungry. That's a physical thing, but your emotions, your feelings will lead you to make a decision uh, as to whether you're going to eat, quinoa and salmon and some broccoli, or if you're going to have a slice of cake, right? Which is something I had yesterday. Excuse me. A little delay in coffee this morning, so I'm having that now. And I was thirsty, and so I got some coffee, right? So we have like this you can't separate the body and soul. They're constantly interacting with each other and making decisions. And then you have the spirit. Now from a from a I want to say a biblical perspective. Okay? It's hard for me to say like a Christian perspective or Jewish perspective. I could say a Jewish perspective because the scriptures are from a Jewish culture and background and ideology and thinking. So, from a Jewish perspective, it's also derived from the Bible that Christians share with the Jewish people for the most part. Uh, the spirit of a person is actually not alive. It's in that it's stuck in the way it lives, and the spirit is influenced by the world. Okay, the spirit is definitely influenced by the world, so the spirit doesn't have a lot of say in what it does. The spirit is influenced by the world, and First John talks about how the world is comprised of the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. Right, and so we have this spirit that is dead, which Paul talks about in Ephesians chapter 2, is dead in trespasses and sin. So before we come to know Jesus and are made one with God, our spirit is dead in that it's kind of like a zombie. It's like the undead, right? It's living, but it's like only focused on a few things. It wants to eat flesh, it wants to run, it wants to scream, it wants to chase people that are alive. It wants to eat that, and then it just wants to rinse, repeat, and cycle or recycle. It just keeps on going. Okay, and that's the problem with the human spirit without it being made alive by God. Now, in Ephesians chapter 2, Paul talks about how our spirit, once we receive Jesus into our life and believe in Him, we receive the Spirit. The Spirit is made alive, and the Spirit is made alive because we're given a new spirit, and that spirit is the Spirit of God. Okay, there's a lot to break down there, but that's just that body, soul, spirit. And what Scazro does here with this graphic, he has emotions, a social aspect of us, intellectual aspect, a spiritual aspect of us, and the physical aspect of us. Okay, and he feels like what like a majority of this is under the surface, and so people aren't focusing on it, and that's trouble, right? Especially when we talk about maturity. How can we become mature if we're not addressing some really big parts of our lives? Okay, some really like big pieces of our lives, I should say. Now, here in trying to get out of the way so you can see the numbers, but it's a little blocked. I apologize for that. Uh, in uh, in the book, as he continues on, he talks about the top 10 symptoms of an emotionally unhealthy spirituality. And if you remember, with his approach, a majority of what we do in church today, or majority of what we do in Christianity today, is we address the top part. You know what people can see. We're connecting. We're going to small groups, whatever. We're giving. We're serving, and so everyone can see that kind of stuff, and it's very surface level. And what he wants to address is the deeper stuff. Like this is what his he believes his program and his writings will address is all the deeper stuff that connects with the graphic we saw earlier with our physical, emotional, our intellectual, and our spiritual health, and social health, and everything, how that all works together, and addressing those different aspects. Now, in this chapter, he discusses here the top 10, what he calls symptoms of someone who hasn't addressed these issues. And so it'd be worth going through them and then having an idea of what it looks like to be emotionally unhealthy. But just listing them: number one, using God to run from God; number two, ignoring anger, sadness, and fear; dying to the wrong things; denying the impact of the past on the present; dividing life into secular and sacred compartments. I say that's a really big one. Doing for God rather than being with God, or doing for God instead of being with God. I should read as he wrote it. And spiritualizing away conflict. Okay. Again, I'm on Kindle with this information. Now, using God to run from God. He had a list here that I thought was important, but just looking at at the material, he talks about all that surface stuff that we do as believers, or certainly I have done in the past, as a way to address my spiritual life, but also as a way to keep it simple and to kind of avoid getting deep with God, right? And these are like on their own, they're not bad things. They it says reading Christian books, engaging in Christian responsibilities outside of the home, devoted time to prayer. But he adds some adjectives to this action, uh, adjectives such as engaging in endless Christian responsibilities. Right, so you're just filling up your time with things you got to do. You got to go to church. You got to go to this prayer meeting. You got to go to this service over here. You've got to go to this cleanup day. You've got all on and on and on. People just kind of book up their time with what he calls Christian responsibilities. Hours and hours spending one book after the other. Oh, I read this book, and I read that book, and I read this book again, and I read that other one, and I listened to this podcast, and I watched this YouTube video, and I watched this preacher, and I did that. Filling up our time. He says by doing so, we are satisfying a need that we have in ourselves, where we want to feel like we're doing what we need to do in order to be a good Christian, and that's trouble. That's trouble for a lot of different reasons. Now he has his list here, and I'll look at them. So he breaks down this concept of of using God to run from God, right? So instead of getting deep with that into that relationship with God and getting close to God and having Him have His presence so near to you that sin is just burning off of you. If you think about Isaiah getting into the presence of God and having just to fall on his face and say, "Whoa, I'm unclean," and like he's saying that Christians actively avoid that nearness by just doing a bunch of stuff, right? So doing God's work to satisfy me, not Him. Doing things in God's name He never asked me to do. Um, there's a lot of applications for that there. I think we'll have some good examples in a second. Praying about God doing my will, but not surrendering to His own, right? Demonstrating Christian behavior so people think well of me, focusing on certain theological points out of concern for my fears and unresolved emotional issues rather than out of concern for God's truth. Now, that's a mouthful there. He has an example with this fictional person named John. John uses God to validate his strong opinions on issues ranging from the appropriate length of women's skirts in church to political candidates to gender roles to his ability to negotiate issues with fellow non-Christian managers at work. Now, this book is a little dated. It's not as recent. So when he talks about gender roles, he's not talking about the conversation we're having today about transgender issues and so on and so forth. He's talking more about, what is a man supposed to do in a home? What is a wife supposed to do in a home? Men work, women do dishes, women um, uh, raise the children, whatever. And so he's using John as an example of how, oh well, I've got my positions on this stuff. Like a man should work, a man should earn more money than his wife. His wife shouldn't have to work; she should stay home, take care of kids. He uses those positions as a way to validate his standing with God and with other Christians. Like if believing in this one thing is what makes you a good person or a good Christian, right? Political candidates. Again, the focus on certain theological points out of concern for my fears and unresolved emotional issues, rather than concern for God's truth. It's a mouthful, but it's a really important concept to understand. This idea that we will vote for somebody out of our own inability to resolve the issues we have inside of us, the fears, the insecurities, the anxieties. What I hear a lot of Christians saying, justifying voting for certain people, is just like this anxiety that one day being a Christian is going to be illegal in this country, right? That's your own emotionally undeveloped, sorry, unconfronted fear, right? There are solutions to that. What if the world turns against you? Jesus teaches about that. There's a way to emotionally handle that kind of fear, right? The way to do it isn't to go ahead and start supporting people out there that we shouldn't support, candidates out there who we shouldn't be idolizing. Okay, it's a really very real fear. But when we don't know how to handle things emotionally, we are going to deal with it in an immature way, and oftentimes in a way that strictly shouldn't do. Using the biblical truth to judge and devalue others. Really, really sad thing that happens. Looking at women in general. In my lifetime, I've heard plenty of women, and mostly women, talk about other women and the way they dress and the clothes they wear. Quoting First Peter, they shouldn't be wearing. In India, they use the old King James, so there's like shouldn't be wearing ornaments, but it's like jewelry, and devaluing those who do. Right, like if you wear a necklace and or a bracelet or earrings to church, that means you're less of a person, because you shouldn't be doing that. You're violating God's law, and um, who are you to do that? And if it makes you feel better, it makes you just like it. It's pretty, whatever. Your feelings don't matter. Devaluing each other and judging each other using biblical truth, like what Peter was trying to address in First Peter, is something different, rather than as a when we're talking about just someone wearing a necklace to church. Exaggerating your accomplishments, making pronouncements, so like Lord told me I should do this, and I thank the Lord, and so on and so forth. So the list is there. Now, so that was point number one. I feel like maybe spent a lot of time on that first one, so I might move a little quickly going on. But that's using God to run from God. Number two is ignoring sadness as fear. Now, this one is pretty important, and he says that, and it could see it here. Many Christians believe wholeheartedly that anger, sadness, and fear are sins to be avoided. And a little after that, he says, like most Christians, I was taught that almost all feelings are unreliable. And then he had this little graphic here, this little train graphic that shows the graphics are so small. So it's a train. You see the front of the train is fact, faith, feeling, and so this is the way he was taught in the past to deal with his feelings. Right? If you come up with a feeling like anger or sadness or fear, those feelings are wrong. Those feelings are sinful. Those feelings shouldn't be had by a Christian. Yada yada yada. So you got to fight those feelings, and the way you do that is with fact. Then you filter the fact through faith, and then the faith will adjust the feeling. So, for an example, if I feel like somebody is being mean to me. Okay, they're being mean. They're just being mean. They're devaluing me. They're insulting me. Well, then I go first to fact. What's the fact? Okay, they are saying X, Y, and Z to me. Right? That's true. Then I go to faith. Now, what am I supposed to do with people who do this? Well, I'm supposed to forgive. I'm supposed to not be angry. I'm not supposed to let the anger sit down. So then I just kind of got to ignore the feeling. Then when it comes to feeling, well, I'm just not supposed to feel this way. So we end up judging our feelings to be wrong. Uh, and it's it doesn't work that way. Not for a healthy someone who's emotionally healthy. Someone who's emotionally healthy doesn't ignore it when they're angry or when they're sad. They acknowledge that those feelings are there, but that's what emotionally unhealthy people do is they do ignore those things, and Christians especially spiritualize those reasons for ignoring those feelings. So that's point number 2. Uh, Point number 3, let's see if I can get that. It's a little block there, but it says point number 3, dying to the wrong thing. So in Luke chapter 9, verse 23, the verse shows there just the end of it. Jesus talks about putting down your daily, laying down your cross and following him, and um, Skazro talks about how we're supposed to die to the sinful parts of who we are, right? The sinful parts of who we are, but not to the good parts. And it reminds me of this message we had heard on Sunday. It was a timely message. It was a good message. It was going through the book of Ecclesiastes and talking about the pleasures in life. And if you've read and studied the book of Ecclesiastes, the point there is to not pursue the pleasures of life as if those are the only things worth living for, because at the end of the day, it's not going to do what you want it to do, right? You just keep chasing feelings and feeling good and pleasure and so on and so forth. It's just going to end up harming you. But the ultimate conclusion of that book is that whatever pleasure we do have, we have to understand, acknowledge where it comes from, that it comes from God, and that it's also temporary. It comes in seasons. We have times where we are blessed and we have good things happen to us. We have times when we don't. And the key is the relationship with God has to remain kind of steady no matter what the situation is. And when Jesus talked about dying to yourself, he's talking to those sinful parts of us that we struggle with. And it's mentioned here at the bottom. Again, I apologize for this, for my my camera being so big here. But you die to sinful things like your defensiveness, your detachment, let's see, detachment from others, arrogance, stubbornness, hypocrisy, judgmentalism, lack of vulnerability, uh, going to the law like do not murder, do not steal. That's what Jesus was talking about. Dying to is the sinful things that we have that are part of us that need to die off, that need to be crucified, right? Not the good parts. So that's point number 3. That's sign number 3 of someone who's emotionally unhealthy and has therefore an unhealthy spirituality is someone who is dying to the wrong things. They're dying to pleasures in life, which is not necessarily what God or Jesus was asking them to do. Number 4, there is denying the impact of the past on the present. Now, what he did here was a really interesting perspective. Was he talked about genealogies? Now, he and his wife were working with a marriage counselor after 9 years of marriage, and they went on to they had to do a genogram, and in the genogram they realized that they were perpetuating a lot of the same roles and cycles that their families of origin did, right? And in the beginning of this chapter, he talks about how terrible life was. The way his dad was this kind of arrogant guy who had his spirituality, went to church and stuff, but then he was just emotionally unavailable. How his mom had issues dealing with the children and so on and so forth. And he continued that pattern. He talked about that here at some point in his ministry, in his life. His wife said she was going to leave him, and looking back on that and seeing that, when you grow up in a home, it's easy to say, when you see the faults of your parents, like I'm not going to do whatever my mom or dad did, right? Like it's easy to kind of say those things, but it's another thing to actually actively not do those things, right? To actively not be the same person your dad was, be the same person your mom was, be the same person that your grandparents were, whoever you raised you um, are, and so that's denying the impact of the past on the present. An emotionally unhealthy person will minimize the impact that their past had on them. That's sign number four. Sign number five of an emotionally unhealthy person is somebody who fails to divide or thinks that life can be divided into the secular and the sacred. And that reminds me of John in the book of Revelation talking about, cold and warm water, hot water coming out of the same spring. You can't do it. You can't live two lives, right? He gives a bunch of anecdotes here, but he has some points too that he talks about, some bullet points of church members giving patterns indicating they're almost as materialistic as other people. He talks about he's actually citing from this book, the scandal of evangelical conscience, and he mentions that according to Gallup polls, let's see if I can get that um, citation in here. It's right here. It's the beginning of right here. It says that ologist is sociologist. So it says, uh, according to Gallup poll and sociologists, one of the greatest scandals of our days that evangelical Christians are as likely to embrace lifestyles every bit as hedonistic, materialistic, self-centered, sexually immoral as the world in general. And the statistics are devastating. And he's citing a book by Ron Sider, The Scandal, Evangelical Consequence, and Gallup polls. Again, some of it's a little dated, but I personally haven't seen a change in any of these issues that are going on. And it just indicates a lot of Christians think that you can do church life, and you can also live your life another way, and that there's no real consequence to that. Now, the thinking behind that is interesting to posit, but right now we don't have the time for it. So, point number six, and we're almost done here, doing for God instead of being with God. Now, here, General, I felt like it was his weakest argument. I think it's like trying to get 10 points when you probably had seven. I do feel like some of these interlap with each other. They kind of bleed into each other. And so maybe this one is just a point to add on. And the add on is you can be doing and doing and doing, right? Going to church and meetings and everything else. And the pandemic certainly stopped us. And what's interesting about the pandemic is how people have kind of stopped going to church, right? Like once something took away your need to go, you fall into a pattern where you're like, well, I really don't want to go anyway, right? And so a lot of people have stopped going, and that's the trick with doing for God instead of being with God. And I've said it in my classes before. It's a little bit of a cheesy sign. Are you a believer? Are you doing for God, or being? Are you human? Sorry, this is what it was. I was trying to think of what it was. Are you human doing or human being? Right? And being with God is different than doing for God. With doing for God, you could be running away from God. You can be justifying actions, but being with God is more about the presence that you have and the presence that God has with your life. Number seven. Now I just finished teaching a class on conflict management, and here goes spiritualizing away conflict is really a huge sign that someone is emotionally unhealthy. When you get into arguments with other people and you sweep them under the rug, you're trying to find a way to not have to deal with the issue. Uh, it's just a sign that you have not figured out how to deal with you. When I taught this conflict management class, I learned that a lot of my students are they're at a very young age emotionally, and a lot of them are still struggling. And we had some conflict in the class, even, and it was a problem. It caused a real big problem with presentations and so on and so forth, and grades. And it's just a sign to me that you can teach conflict management and everything, but teaching maturity to people is another thing, and helping people develop maturity is another thing. Now, Skazero has a list of stuff that we do that indicate that we are spiritualizing conflict, or we're not able to deal with conflict head on. So, saying one thing to people's faces, another thing behind their backs, right? Making promises we have no intention of keeping, blaming, attacking, giving people the silent treatment, becoming sarcastic, be what we can get, give in because we're afraid of not being liked, so we give in to conflict and whatever's going on. We don't want people to like us. Leaking our anger, uh, with an with an email. She's talking there about gossip and just kind of side talking issues, not directly confronting them, only telling half truths, saying yes when we mean no. That's a big one for not wanting to deal with conflict. Someone's asking you to do something or be somewhere, and you just say yes because you don't want them to hear you say no. That's trouble. Avoiding and withdrawing, and finding a person outside to talk about it, but more like gossip. And he makes a really good point about Jesus and conflict. Jesus never avoided conflict. He had conflict his entire ministry that we read about. He never avoided it. He dealt with it head on. Now there are ways he dealt with it that might be different, but he always dealt with it. But an emotionally unhealthy person will find ways to avoid it. Number 8, covering our brokenness, weakness, and failures. Here, you know, is speaking to the immaturity, and just the emotionally unhealthy person, and the immature person who can't acknowledge their faults. Right? I know I'm not perfect, and I hear a lot of people say that, but can you list the things that you're not perfect about? And I'm not very good at getting things done, and I like to say, like I might have some ADHD or something. Like I make plans, I do things. It's hard for me, but I'm 40 years old and I still have trouble getting tasks done on time. It's a struggle for me, and staying focused on work. That's a big problem for me, and I'm trying to work on it. We're trying to develop it, but I can't hide that. I can't pretend like I do, and it bothers me that the video is not there. It's blocking the thing, and I didn't take the time to figure that out. And I was a little rushed for time this morning. I probably should have woke myself up earlier so I had more time to prepare and do things the way I wanted to do them. Those I can always criticize myself. Sometimes we criticize ourselves so much, but we still are trying to cover up those things rather than let them out. And one of the reasons why we have community is for that, to be able to be open with each other. But covering that stuff up and covering up our failures, our brokenness, our weakness, a sign of immaturity, and unhealthy. Living there, it's cut off again, bothers me, but on me. Living without limits. Now, first I thought he meant again like doing whatever you want kind of concept, but no, what he's actually talking about is boundaries. Uh, Emotionally unhealthy people don't know how to create boundaries in their life with the people that are in their lives. And in the anecdote he told early in the story, in the chapter, he talked about how his daughter almost drowned in a pool. She's 3 years old. By the time they found her, she was like up to her chin in the water, and she was on her tippy toes. It wasn't a very big pool, thank God, where she could have just kept floating. Like this was the deep point, was just that much. And the reason why it happened is because someone just met him at church that day and asked him to meet. And so he said, okay. And he let the guy come to this house with his wife. And the guy was just talking, talking, talking. Apparently, it was going on for a very long time. And during that whole time, lost sight of where his daughter was. And it was his wife who, at one point, was like, oh, well, where is Faith? And so they went to go look for her. And there she was in the pool, chin up to water, and she almost died. And just because he couldn't tell this guy, hey, listen, I'm glad you came. You drove all the way from Connecticut. He was in New York. I'm glad you came. And I just wish that uh, we had time to meet today, but today's not a good day. We can make an appointment. We can talk later. And I know you came and you drove. That's awesome that you did that. I really appreciate it. But I have my office hours, I have my appointment hours, and That's something that I learned a long time ago. But living without limits, not knowing like, okay, I can't do this, ticking on 100 things. Like, oh, when we were in India this past November, I got to the point where I was, I went prepared to do 10 sessions on discipleship, but a couple of days before we were supposed to fly out, maybe a week. I maybe less gracious than I remember. Maybe a week or 2 weeks out. I don't feel like it was a lot of time. I was asked to lead all these Bible studies and Sunday services too, right? And it's because the pastor who was going, he couldn't get his visa done, so he was going to be stuck here in the U.S. And so he needed someone who's like, oh, I was happy to do it, but with all the classes and all the Bible studies and the jet lag, I was just burned out. At some point, I emailed him like, "Hey," or texted him, "I can't do this anymore. I need a break." I knew my boundaries were there, and I ended up only missing like one meeting, like or no, two meetings. I ended up missing only two of the meetings that I because I intended to stop, or three, I should say. It was two Bible studies and one Sunday service that I didn't do. But and then I did two others that I wasn't planning to do, but I did them because then at that point the spirit wanted me to, but I had my boundaries and I said, okay, I need a break, I need a rest, I need to go out and enjoy Delhi, or I need to do something, I need to relax, and I did that. I had my own time. And you just have to know your limits. You have to know your limits and you have to live with them, not without them. And number 10, judging other people's spiritual journey, right? That's the last point here. And I have to admit that's hard for me. It's easy to look at other people and think, that they're lacking in their spirituality. But what I've learned is while you can do that, it's another thing to devalue them and judge them and to dismiss them. Like, oh, he's just not there. Like, so as I live my life, I see that there are people out there that need help, that can grow spiritually, and uh, grow healthier in their walk with God and emotionally. And this is where this all spawned from. And 2 weeks ago, I was complaining about a message and the way the guys the approach to it like really bothered me. And someone challenged me, "What are you going to do about it?" Well, this is it. To address the audience at large and say, we can be better, we can heal emotionally, and we can develop spiritually into stronger versions of ourselves and transform into that image of Jesus that we're looking for. So it's just like judging people for it. It's like I want to try to help people, right? So anyway, I am done. I am thankful for the time. So like I said earlier, probably going to stream sooner than 6 o'clock, maybe 5 p.m. I gotta get in touch with the people I'm going with to the soccer game, find out what time I'm supposed to meet for a carpool, so on and so forth. But I'm thinking probably 5 o'clock. But I think I'm gonna leave the schedule the way it is, and then just post it later. And I'll be probably playing video games with my daughter, and we'll see what comes up naturally from all this. So, and thanks for watching, and I will see you all soon.